I'm acutely aware of speaking in between Marla Tribich and my uncle Max, two people who bear witness to the events of the 1930s and 40s, and whose testimony is therefore part of the historical record. I was born in London in 1949, so I have no such claim on your attention. For the post-war generation, the struggles against fascism in the 1930s and the horrors resulting from the failure of those struggles are a matter not of individual, but of collective memory. They are passed down as family history. My grandparents, Harry Levitas and Leah Rick, met and married in Dublin in 1914. They were part of a wave of Jewish emigration from Lithuania, Latvia, and Russia, driven partly by anti-Semitic pogroms and partly by the promise of a better life, especially in America. The distinction between refugee and economic migrant was not yet enshrined in immigration laws and is in some ways immaterial. Those members of Harry and Leah's families who stayed in Akmayan and Riga, respectively, were murdered in the early 1940s. Max, my father Maury, and three younger children were born in Dublin. The difficulty of finding work and housing drove them to Glasgow in 1927 and to London's East End in 1931, where Max still lives. Both Max and my father Maury, and I suspect their younger brother Sol and their father Harry, were present at the blockade of Cable Street in 1936. My father subsequently joined the international brigades in Spain, fighting to defend the democratically elected Republican government against the insurgent nationalist forces led by General Franco and supported by Hitler. Family history, though, is still intensely personal. I'm a sociologist. One of the best accounts of what sociology is comes from C. Wright Mills, who describes it in terms of the intersection of private troubles and public issues, the understanding of personal history in terms of public history, the move from individual to collective memory. And yet, as Susan Sontag says, the idea of collective memory is itself somewhat odd. In her book on war photography, Regarding the Pain of Others, she argues that, strictly speaking, there is no such thing as collective memory. All memory is individual, unreproducible. It dies with each person. So what we call collective memory is not a remembering, but a stipulating that this is important, and that this is the story about how it happened, with the pictures that lock the story in our mind. For my generation, then, remembrance or commemoration of the events of Cable Street in Spain is from the outset a political act, a statement of their importance not just as history, but as politics, relevant to our situation now. So I want to do four things. To very briefly sketch that history, for anyone who is not familiar with it, to say something about Sontag's point about the visual, the important role of image in relation to the struggles themselves and their remembrance. To say something about how the act of commemoration, together with its visual aspects, helps form solidarity in the present. And, of course, to say something about why such solidarity remains an urgent and pressing need in the present political climate, certainly across Europe, but also more widely. So first, some history. The 1920s had seen an unprecedented concentration of wealth and a stock market bubble. When the bubble burst with the Wall Street crash of 1929, both America and Europe were plunged into financial crisis. The 1930s were marked by depression, unemployment, and poverty, and by the rise of fascism and anti-Semitism across Europe. In Britain, the public face of this was Oswald Mosley's British Union of Fascists, although the British upper class was saturated with similar attitudes. On the 4th of October 1936, Mosley's black shirts planned to march through the East End of London, then a largely Jewish area. The East End has been home to successive waves of immigrants and refugees. Huguenots in the 17th century, the Irish in the 19th century, Jews in the early 20th century, and now has a multi-ethnic population, including a lot of people of Bangladeshi origin. Although local politicians tried to have Mosley's march banned, they were unsuccessful. So Cable Street and the surrounding streets were blockaded by local people: Irish dockers, Jews, communists, trade unionists, Labour Party supporters. 10,000 police were deployed, but they were unable to clear a passage for the march, which eventually had to be called off. And I think we're now just going to have a newsreel clip from the time, which is about 2-minute time. The adulation of the police there. But Cable Street has iconic significance because of this collective popular refusal by ordinary people to be divided against each other. It was a significant victory over racism and fascism. But 1936 was also the year in which civil war broke out in Spain. The Republican government was elected in February, but by July there were military uprisings. Hitler had pledged support to the nationalist insurgency. The Soviet Union pledged help to the Republic. And the first international volunteers supporting the Republican side arrived in Spain in the belief that if the fight against fascism was lost here, it would be lost across Europe. In September, Franco was named head of state and commander-in-chief of the armed forces by a military junta. And in November, he was recognized by both Germany and Italy as the head of Spain's government. Hitler and Mussolini's military support meant that the Republicans were defeated. Britain and France recognized Franco's government early in 1939. They had been formally neutral, a neutrality which in Britain's case included making it illegal to volunteer for the brigades. In April, the Republicans surrendered. Franco remained in power until 1975, and the legacy of the war is still disturbing and divisive. So the Battle of Cable Street was on the one hand a local event mobilizing local people, and on the other hand a microcosm of the wider European fight against fascism. The slogans of Cable Street and Spain were the same: no pasarán, they shall not pass. The most familiar image relating to Spain is Picasso's Guernica, a response to the bombing of the Basque town of Guernica by German and Italian warplanes in 1937. Now, this image is in some ways too familiar, present in bad reproduction in kitsch images on mugs. The painting itself, which I saw for the first time 10 years ago in Madrid, is huge and full of visceral rage. It was exhibited at the Whitechapel Art Gallery in 1939. A life-size tapestry was made in the 1950s, lent to the United Nations headquarters in New York as a deterrent to war. Now, Guernica is not the only example of art produced in aid of Spain. There's the Miro image, Aide Spain, originally intended as a design for a stamp, which is why it says 1 franc on it. But there was a striking use of graphic art in the posters of the Aid Spain movement. Just flip through some of them. And this one ends by saying, if you tolerate this, your children will be next. W.H. Auden wrote a poem first published under separate cover and sold in aid of Spain. And in London, the British volunteers are commemorated by this sculpture on the South Bank, unveiled in 1985. Inscribed on the plinth are the words, "They went because their open eyes could see no other way," which is a paraphrase of lines from Cecil Day-Lewis's 1938 poem, The Volunteer. Tell them in England, if they ask, what brought us to these wars, to this plateau beneath the night's grave manifold of stars. It was not fraud or foolishness, glory, revenge, or pay. We came because our open eyes could see no other way. The Battle of Cable Street is commemorated by a mural at 236 Cable Street, a building which was, I gather at one time, the London headquarters of the International Brigade. And just these are some pictures of the mural and some details of it. This one with the marbles, it was actually my mother who told me that in the 1930s it was very important to take marbles in your pockets as defence against the police horses being used as weapons. Work began on the mural, so it's still on the mural, in the 1970s, and it was first completed in 1983. It's been vandalised on more than one occasion, including during the 1990s. The artist restoring it had paint poured on his car and his car tyres slashed. But the link between Spain and the radical history of the East End is also reproduced. The painting of Guernica is now too fragile to travel. The tapestry returned to Whitechapel in 2009-10 as part of an installation by the Polish artist Gorzka Makuga. A stipulation that this is important, with the image that locks the story in our minds. Makuga's installation at the Whitechapel was both art and politics, art as politics and politics as art. And in that respect, it resembles the work of Jeremy Deller, whose Joy in People exhibition was held at the Hayward Gallery earlier this year. Deller's work included an exhibition about the 1984 miners' strike, together with a film of a reenactment of the Battle of Orgreave, a major confrontation between miners and the police. Deller had also facilitated an event called Procession, a parade to open Manchester's International Festival in 2009, both engaging contemporary community groups and looking to Manchester's history. And among the banners designed for that event was the eponymous Joy in People banner, and another banner in the purple, white and green colours of the suffrage, which reads, "Our ancestors were at Peterloo." Now, the battle or massacre of Peterloo was a demonstration for political representation in 1819 at St. Peter's Field in Manchester. A crowd of 60 to 80,000 civilians were charged by cavalry, 15 people were killed and hundreds injured. But my initial response to Deller's banner was one of unease. Is that, I wondered, entirely appropriate and inclusionary in multi-ethnic Manchester, when many people's ancestors certainly were not at Peterloo? My companion, who is over there, responded, yes, but it means our class ancestors. So yes, it includes everyone in solidarity for a better life. And that led me to reflect more on what acts of commemoration and the banners that we carry on such occasions actually do. Because in September 2011, less than a year ago, the English Defence League proposed to march through the multi-ethnic East End of London. Unlike 1936, that march was banned, despite a statement from the Metropolitan Police that the EDL is not an extremist organisation. But there was a 30-day ban on all marches in the area, so the EDL staged static demonstrations, and there was also a large counter-demonstration by Unite Against Fascism. 3,000 police were deployed to keep the demonstrators apart. A month later, on an unseasonably hot 2nd of October, I joined the march and rally commemorating the 75th anniversary of Cable Street. The official placard makes reference both to Cable Street, they did not pass, and the contemporary rise of fascism, they shall not pass. The original slogan, again, of Cable Street and Spain. But I just want to run through a range of banners and of groups represented. Some of these banners are specifically commemorative, like the banner of the International Brigades and the Connolly Column, the Irish Volunteers in Spain. But many of them are not. And I think to see how the visual presence of these banners works, you need to try to imagine the march without them. It would still be a statement of solidarity, but one in which we come together as atomized individuals. What the banners do, I think, is something more than provide a colourful and cheerful procession. They record and display our particular identities and affiliations, while at the same time affirming our solidarity and our shared existence. So they create a new identity, a solidarity which does not depend on erasing our different histories, but which accommodates those within our now common predicament and new collective life. The academic literature makes a distinction between two different kinds of memory, which help us to think about what we are doing in an act of commemoration. On the one hand, there's anamnesis, which is simple recall of the past. On the other, there is anagnoresis, a process of recognition, where the gap between past and present is not collapsed. As Vincent Gagan puts it, in anagnoresis, memory traces are reactivated in the present, but there is never a simple correspondence between the past and the present because of all the intervening novelty. The power of the past resides in its complicated relationship of similarity and dissimilarity to the present. The tension thus created helps shape the new, and the experience, therefore, is creatively shocking. Refugee Week draws our attention to the growing numbers of people across the world who are displaced by persecution, conflict, famine, and disaster. But within Europe, economic crisis and uncertainty are producing a situation only too similar to that of the 1920s and 1930s, the seedbed of racism and fascism. It is evident in the rise of the far right in this country and in France, and especially in Greece, where the neo-Nazi Golden Dawn Party won 21 seats in the first inconclusive general election in May and 18 in the second election last Sunday. Since 2009, there has been a major rise in racist violence, including anti-Semitic violence in Greece, and Golden Dawn has been implicated in some of these attacks. And after 2 elections, the country remains so politically polarised that there is a real risk of civil war, a risk that Greece may be the new Spain. Refugee Week does not mean that we can remember this week and forget for the rest of the year. It rightly reminds us of the need to provide sanctuary for those immediately fleeing persecution, as well as those at risk of discrimination, persecution, and murder within their own country. It should also remind us of the need, always and everywhere, to counter the political and economic conditions that produce such persecution, that lead to racism and fascism, and of the need to build a better and more decent world. For me, the meaning of Cable Street and of Spain is simply this: the struggle changes, but the struggle is always the same. We need to remember because we forget at our peril. And yes, as Sontag said, this is for many of us, not strictly speaking, a question of memory, but a stipulation that this is important, and it is carried in the images that lock the story in our mind.